This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about coding locomotion on the unit. This is an indicator of quality. If we were to look at locomotion on unit, the only thing that matters in the quality measure aspect is the self-performance. It does not take into consideration the number of people that were needed to assist when configuring the quality measure. However, it is still just as important that both areas are accurately reflected for the patient care during each shift. Locomotion on unit is how the resident moves between locations in his or her room and the adjacent corridor. If they're in a wheelchair, we only look at how they move once they're in the wheelchair. So this lets you know that locomotion not only addresses how it is that someone is walking around in their room, but also once they're in the wheelchair, how they move around in that chair. And as with all the other ADLs, we have the ability to code independent, supervision, limited and extensive assist, as well as total dependence. The patient is not available, the patient refused, and not applicable. The only time that not applicable would be appropriate is if the patient didn't get out of bed. This is because the question is asking how the person moves around their room or the adjacent hallway outside the room, either by ambulating or wheelchair. Once you transfer a person out of bed or they transfer themselves out of bed themselves, they must move or are moved somewhere in or around their room and potentially even out into the hallway along the walls of their room. On unit codes just that, how they move about in their room, including their bathroom, and then in the adjacent hallway, which would mean if they went out their door, one doorway to the right, one doorway to the left. Those walls in that hallway are the adjacent hallway to the interior of that room. This movement in their room or that hallway along their room is what you are considering when you're coding locomotion on unit. So for example, if you transfer the person into a wheelchair and then you or they move that wheelchair closer to their TV, into their bathroom, or even just outside of their door in the hall, you code how that happened when you're looking at locomotion on unit. Independent would be once they were out of their bed, they moved in and around their room with no influence or assistance with that movement. That's independent. Supervision means that once they were out of their bed, you cued them to move in and around their room, or perhaps called them to the hall, but didn't touch the patient or the wheelchair. This is supervision. It would not be appropriate for patients that walk to be coded as total dependence. How is it that you would have someone who was totally dependent on you or another person for walking? That would mean that you physically supported 100% of their weight through that activity. The only way that would be logical is if the patient indeed was standing on your feet with your arms under their arms and you literally walked them down the hall. So this is not going to be appropriate to code total dependence if they walk. It could be appropriate for the wheelchair. When the resident is not available, that means the patient has been out of the building for your entire shift. Now, if they went to dialysis or they went out on a family LOA sometime during your shift, we don't say the patient wasn't available because they did move inside their room and in that hallway just outside of their room to get to the exit. So just because they weren't there for the bulk of your shift doesn't mean that locomotion on unit didn't happen if they were there for even minutes inside your shift. And then resident refusal, most likely not applicable, as once the patient is up and out of bed, although you may have behavioral patients that seem resistant to what it is you're trying to accomplish, they still are going to have moved in and about their room and the adjacent hallway. And as we talked about when we opened this up, not applicable is only going to be appropriate if they didn't get out of bed for your entire shift. So now we've talked about independent and supervision and all of these others that are probably not going to be as appropriate. And we are now left with limited assist and extensive assist. So limited is going to be more likely appropriate for those that walk, since you may put your hand on them as they're moving about the room. And you could also do extensive assist with walking as well. And then finally, extensive assist is probably going to be more appropriate for those that are in a wheelchair or some other chair, such as a Broda, a Jerry chair, or a tilt in space, where the patient might use their feet a little bit to scoot around, but you have to push the chair for the more significant movements in and around their room. So what are some of the common coding discrepancies we see when people are coding this? Staff are coding that the resident walked. Okay, so this is a separate ADL from locomotion on unit. We're saying they ambulated, but then you code locomotion on unit as did not occur. Where did they ambulate? Did you take them through their room, down the hall, and then started to walk them basically off unit? So consider that. You code that the resident transferred. Again, a different ADL than locomotion on unit. All right, but then you're coding that this locomotion didn't occur. Once you transferred them, did you just leave them there in that spot? You code the resident was showered, but you code locomotion on unit didn't occur. The patient had to travel through their room and down the adjacent hall to get to that shower. Think about this. A patient goes to the dining area or an activity area or to the hairdresser. They have to move through their room excuse me, to get to these locations. Should you be coding that locomotion on unit didn't occur? So worsened locomotion on a unit, like I said, is an indicator of quality. CMS believes that when people have declines in some of these functions, then it's an indicator of them going to have additional decline in other aspects of their ADLs. This is a very sensitive quality measure, and it does impact your 5-star. So this is more of an MDS coding alert and not really relevant to the CNAs outside of once you've coded for your shifts, how the MDS coordinator ends up coding it on the actual MDS. So a decline in just one ADL between two of the last MDSs will trigger this quality measure. So for example, if we say the patient was independent on one MDS and then it worsens to supervision on the next, it's going to trigger. If we say they were supervision on one and it worsens to limited assist, it's going to trigger. Limited assist worsens to extensive, will trigger. Extensive worsens to total. So you can see that it's just one level up and it's going to trigger on your quality measures. And you should note that independent supervision, limited or extensive on one MDS that is then followed by a code of a 7 or 8, meaning that they no longer had locomotion on the unit because they weren't out of bed, or a 7, it only happened 1 or 2 times, will also trigger a decline. And that's because a 7 or an 8 on an MDS is considered a 4 when we are doing QM methodology. So it's very important that first CNAs get this accurate on the day-to-day, and that MDS coordinators are choosing the ARDs that are getting this data reflective of the patient's status in a last 7-day look back, and understand when this is going to trigger your quality measures. So I thank you again for joining us for one of these ADLs, and I look forward to the coding that I see. Have a great day.